I never meant to make a discovery like this. Although, I suppose no one does. The great discoveries, the ones that really change the world, are seldom the product of intentional design. Still, I wasn't expecting something quite so world-shattering to come out of what should have been a simple college assignment. I was a psychology student before all of this, trying to simply make it through my underclass years. Psychology was one of those odd majors. It straddled the line between art and science, and the university program recognized that fact. On one side, you had the theoretical approach to psychology, which is practically indistinguishable from sociology or philosophy. On the other side, you had the more scientific approach, which involved a rigorously physical analysis of the brain and all the chemical reactions that went into cognition. As such, it was possible for an undergraduate to get either a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. The determining factor would be your electives. If your electives were more aligned with the fine arts and social sciences, you would get a BA. On the other hand, if you had a certain number of credits in the quote, real sciences, your degree would be a scientific one, which my advisor assured me was far more reputable and well respected. I was only 3 credits away. I only needed to take just one more class to graduate with what he assured me was a far more useful degree. His sales pitch won me over. He then handed me an oddly greasy laminated sheet enumerating all the possible science courses. There were a few courses that fit with the rest of my schedule. One was physics, which seemed entirely too difficult to add to my already stressful final semester. Another was geology, which seemed far too boring. The last was Intro to Astronomy, which immediately piqued my interest. I had always liked looking up at the stars, even as a kid. I remember laying out in the backyard on warm summer nights. Our whole family would spread out on the grass and look up at the sky. My father would point out the stars and constellations and tell us their names and how far away they were. My mother would tell us the myths and legends associated with each object and delight my brother and I with stories of gods and monsters. The first few weeks of class were harder than I expected. There were so many niche terms and oddly specific jargon that we had to memorize and regurgitate. Most of our work was simply flipping through our needlessly expensive textbook to find 1 or 2 incomprehensible scientific definitions and copying them into our assignments. It wasn't until our final projects were announced that things finally got interesting. Each of us was given almost free rein to explore any project we found interesting. The only requirements were that it must be related to astronomy and it must have our professor's approval. I approached him with a radical idea, one that I still maintain was a moment of genius. I had the idea to simulate the sound of the sun. This is by no means my idea. Many think of the sun as a silent entity, a mute observer hanging inertly above our planet. This is not the case. The sun is the most massive and powerful object in our solar system. Every moment of every day, it constantly churns with colossal swirling eddies of plasma, any of which could in an instant wipe away our entire species. These movements create a colossal cacophony rippling out across the fluid surface of the sun. By studying these ripples, the way they bounce and echo throughout the plasma of the sun, we can glean an insight into the nature and composition of the sun. This is common knowledge in the field of astronomy, but I wanted to take it a step further. It was my intention to combine all the sounds of the sun, not just the large crescendos, but the subtle vibrations of the plasma, the swirl of solar wind. My professor was completely behind it. He made a number of helpful suggestions. He recommended that I use our physics department's simulator, and even helped expedite the veritable mountain of paperwork to get me access. On the appointed day, I navigated through the labyrinth of sterile and self-same hallways to the dark oak door of the simulator. I gulped down my nerves and knocked. The door was opened by a tall, skinny man in a black polo. He had dark curly hair and dark eyes. His skin gave the impression that it would have been several shades closer to something considered normal if it ever saw the sunlight. He was both skinny and out of shape, like he hadn't worked out a day in his life. All in all, he gave the impression of a relatively standard academic, but seemed to take pride in his appearance that set him apart from most of the other people in his career track. He reminded me strongly of a Tim Burton character. He introduced himself as David and welcomed me in the dark and cramped confines of the computer room. I sat down on a rickety stool and looked awkwardly at him, waiting for him to say something. Instead, he leaned back in the room's only chair and appraised me. "So," he finally said after several minutes of uncomfortable silence, "you're the one hogging the simulator today." "Well, I'm not quite hogging it," I said defensively. "I'm trying to create a revolutionary sonic landscape of the sun that I know I have read your proposals." He cut me off. "I've been assigned to assist you in using the simulator. Make sure you don't break anything, which really means that I'll do all the real work just for you to take credit at the end." "Hey, I'm willing to put in my share. There's no reason to be so combative." "Yeah, there kind of is. You know, there are actual scientists who have to wait months to get even a few hours in here. And in a matter of days, you have the whole thing booked just because Stevenson threw his weight around as department head." "Hey, what makes you think this isn't scientific?" I asked, insulted. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You wouldn't know science if it bit you on the ass." Well, maybe not when it bit me, but I'm sure I could use careful experimentation and observation of the bite to figure out what science is. It was too dark for me to see his reaction, but he made a noise that was either a cough or a chortle, and I took that as a sign to continue. "Look, a huge part of the science on the university level is community perception, which gets more attention. Scientists use this new simulation to track air particles in the upper atmosphere, or scientists lets you listen to the sun." "The second one," he admitted, grudgingly. "And the way I see it, getting your lab some extra press and attention from the bigwigs on the Board of Regents can't hurt. No one's saying we're doing Nobel work here, but we can certainly help get a few extra bucks for your department." "I guess you've got a point. I read your proposal like I said, and you clearly have no clue how to operate this thing." "Guilty as charged," I said. "I wasn't asking, but thanks for the confirmation. So just let me handle all the heavy lifting when it comes to the simulation, and we'll be good. Just forward that data you referred to in your paper, and I'll get cracking." I did as he asked, forwarding all the data I had on the movement of the sun, its ejections, and the behaviors of plasma as a medium for sound. He and I sent a few more emails back and forth to each other, before he went silent. For weeks, every time I reached out to him, I heard nothing back. Then one day, out of the blue, my phone rang with an unknown number. I held it to my ear and nearly jumped.
"Bro, you need to get over here,"
David shouted excitedly. "Whoa, whatever happened to good morning? How are you today?"
"Stop being an ass and come over here. You were right. This is incredible."
Without another word, he hung up, leaving me confused and frustrated on the other end of the phone. I changed into some semi-professional clothes and made my way over to the physics building. David was waiting for me and quickly ushered me inside. The stool had been replaced by a proper chair, which I took as a compliment. He was practically bouncing up and down in his seat. "I've never seen you so excited," I observed dryly. "Well, I finally finished the simulation. Not an easy task, might I add. Like truly, monumentally awful, but I enjoyed the challenge all the same. And today, I got a sound. And well, you just have to hear it for yourself." With that, he leaned over and flicked the switch. At first, I couldn't pick out the sound from the background hum of the electronics around me. After a few moments, I was able to pick up a slight humming noise at the edges of my perception. As I focused, the sound became clearer and clearer. A deep, throbbing vibration that I felt more than heard. After a while, I was able to identify other noises mixed in. Loud crashing crescendos, rhythmic high notes, mournfully warbling noises layered over the other harmonies. The more I listened, the more I heard. It was beautiful. Haunting, certainly, but beautiful. It sounds deliberate, I finally said, half hating myself for interrupting the noise. It sounds like music. David grinned at me. I don't know about that, but there is certainly a rhythm to it. I could listen to it all day. Well, we would be if sound could travel through a vacuum, I joked. You were right. This is just the kind of thing people would go nuts for. If we come out and say that the sun is singing, we'll make national news with this shit. Right, but let's keep this between us until we're ready to publish. The last thing we need is someone coming in at the last second and stealing our work. Oh, 100%. There's no way I'm telling anyone about this. At least, not until we can tell everyone about this. We swore our pact of secrecy, and then covertly went our separate ways. It felt fun at the time, to be co-conspirators in this niche academic topic. I walked home on cloud 9, overjoyed at the discovery we had made. The sound really was beautiful, melodic and hypnotic in equal measure. As I walked home, the sound stuck in my brain, like the chorus to a pop song. I even started humming it when I got back to my dorm. My human vocal cords trying and failing to recapture the sound. That night was the first night I had the dream. I had just gotten into bed when I thought I heard the noise again. This time the pitch was slightly different, but the patterns were unmistakable. It was deafeningly loud. So loud that it shook the entire building, raining down dust on my face. I thought it might be an earthquake and was deathly afraid. I wanted to get up and hide, but found I couldn't move a muscle. I felt as if my entire body was being pulled down towards the bed by a Jovian pressure. The sound was terribly loud and full of self-assured authority that something primitive in my brain couldn't help but respond to. Almost instinctively, I hummed out a response, the rising and falling of my voice matching the pitch of the rumbling noise. The sound only got louder, until I thought the force of it would tear me apart. As I lay, helpless in my bed, unwillingly harmonizing to the music, I watched as the room was filled with a dazzling light. A light brighter than any I'd ever seen before blasted through my dorm's one window, turning the darkness inside the room into daylight. The light was a soothing color, silvery blue layered over cool white. I saw the window open slowly and watched as a tendril of luminescent blue vapor gently flowed into the room. Over the course of what felt like hours, it meandered around the room, touching every surface, as if blindly feeling out the contents. I couldn't shake the horrible certainty that it was looking for something. Looking for me. My horror only mounted as it slithered closer and closer to me, before finally arriving at the foot of my bed. I could do nothing to fight back, as it painstakingly moved over my bed sheets, before hovering over my face. Almost gently, it reached out, as if to caress my cheek. In the instant it made contact with me, I screamed in agony. It was the single coldest thing I'd ever felt. So cold that it burned. It wrapped around me, and I felt it lift me off the bed. It was as quick then as it had been meticulous before. It roughly dragged me out through the window, making its strange noises the entire time. It pulled me endlessly upwards. In less than a millisecond, I watched as first my dorm, then the city, then the continent fall away before me, as I was rent through the atmosphere. Still, we kept moving, and soon, the entire planet was beneath me, before it shrunk to a distant blue marble. And then, an even more distant blue speck. In a matter of moments, I was pulled past the swirling clouds and shining rings of Saturn. I lost all frame of reference once I left the solar system. It continued on like that for several minutes, taking me further and further from my home. I saw swirling nebula in colors humanity does not have the words to describe. I saw the indescribable darkness of empty space, and then was blinded by unimaginable light. I watched countless planets go by, covered in structures that defied my understanding of physics. I felt a gnawing cold of complete absence. I felt the scorching heat of burning stars. I screamed at the pain, screamed at the size and the overwhelming presence of what I witnessed. I screamed until I had no air, until I was sure my vocal cords were snapped, and then I kept on screaming. The force continued to tow me through all of this, before depositing me at some preordained spot in the vastness of space. At first, I thought it no different than any other place I had seen on my journey. Then I heard a sound. The same keening sound that the simulation had made an eternity ago. My body turned around, and I saw a great blue sphere of light in front of me. Suddenly, another spot of light appeared above and behind it. It too started giving off the same sort of noise, with the same rhythms and sounds. Then, another star appeared. One at a time, and then faster and faster, more stars appear in the sky, each adding their own voice to the song. Soon, millions at a time, in every color, at every pitch, burst into being around me. All the stars in the universe were in attendance in this strange concert, with my minuscule form at the center. Words cannot convey the magnitude of the noise that they made. No other sound on earth was even close to that din. I felt as if my very soul was being torn apart in the sound of it. It was too much, too big, too many things all trying to be heard all at once. It was a cacophony. But over time, I gradually began to feel the rhythm of their sounds. That is, when I had my epiphany. What my faulty organic mind had perceived as chaos was actually the most sublime order. I recognized the rhythms and the patterns, and finally came to the realization that the sounds were words. By degrees, I began to gain a rudimentary understanding of what they were saying, started to feel what they were saying. They told me of their loneliness. They welcomed me as one of their own, and told me the names of the great stars who had given their lives to make the elements that composed me. Most of all, they told me how happy they were to have another mind to speak to, an audience for their stories. Their joy was pure, so childlike and wholesome, finally able to speak and be understood. I was overwhelmed at the goodness of it all, and wept tears of joy for their sake. That's how I woke up, weeping, crying like a baby. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that I was in a field. I staggered to my feet and looked around. I was standing in the middle of a cinched circle, with alfalfa around as far as the eye could see. I made my way through the field until I found a dirt path. Knowing that there would probably be civilization at least one end of the road, I started walking along, following the tire tracks north. The sun began to rise at some point in my journey, and not long after that, I heard the rumbling of a motor coming up from behind me. The farmer who owned these fields got out of the truck and talked to me, but when I tried to talk to him, I found that I had forgotten the English words to describe what I wanted. I dared not to speak to him in the language of the stars. Something inside of me knew, even then, that his mind couldn't handle their great words. After some difficulty, I managed to remember enough to convey my desires to him, and he took me back to his house. I used his phone to call my roommate to come and get me, with him and his wife doing most of the talking. She was as generous as he was polite, and poured me a glass of lemonade as I gradually came back to my senses. After a few hours, I had regained enough of my memory to tell them that I had no idea how I ended up in their field. I told them that I'd been hit in the head during a fight, and the next thing I knew, I had woken up here. I felt bad for lying to them and knew that they didn't fully believe me. But they were still both very kind to me until my roommate showed up. I didn't say much on the 3-hour ride back from the farm to our college. He asked me so many questions on that trip, and I had so few answers. I couldn't explain to him how I had gotten to that farm. I couldn't explain to him what had happened to me or the things I've seen. I was so immensely apologetic, I had no memory of it at all. I assured him that I was fine and that no one had drugged me, but that I just couldn't remember how I had gotten there that night. I admit that I became a pretty terrible roommate after that event, but I just couldn't help it. Every time I went to sleep after that, my dreams would be of the stars. They taught me so much. They told me stories that they had accumulated over the eons, shared sage wisdom, told ancient jokes. They taught me more and more about their language and culture, as I taught them about mine. Their language conveys concepts more than words. They speak in impressions and emotions. I nicknamed the language Starspeak and started to become quite fluent in it. I even learned to read and write in the language. They don't use letters. Each glyph is a fully realized idea, comparable to a sentence in English. The symbols take the form of complicated swirls and arches. What we know as coronal mass ejections, when drawn on paper, they look like a mixture of alchemical runes in spiraling fractals. While these dreams were both fun and enlightening to me, they were terrifying to my roommate. On one of the first nights after I got back, I woke to him shaking me awake. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I be?" "'Cause you were making weird noises and laughing in your sleep. It was creepy as hell, man." "Really? What kind of noises?" "This sort of whistling hum. It was freaky. It didn't sound like any noise a human should be capable of making." "Oh, I'm sorry. I have no idea what that was," I lied. "I'll try to stop, as much as I can. I mean, I'm not doing it on purpose." "Yeah, I hope you do. That shit was not normal." With a wary glance back my way, he turned and headed back to sleep. I really did want to stop, for his sake at least. But like I told him, I wasn't doing it consciously. I'd always talked in my sleep, but normally I did so in English. If I started doing it in Starspeak, that just wasn't something I had control of. I started taking naps during the times he was out of the room to not freak him out, but I quickly discovered that my body couldn't sustain that spotty sleep schedule. In fact, it was even making my sleep talking worse on the nights when I did fall asleep. After a few nights of that, he started spending more of his time at his girlfriend's apartment, which helped alleviate the conflict. That was partially why he wasn't there when the incident occurred. It was late afternoon last Friday when I got a knock on my door. I opened it to see a disheveled man slouching against the door frame. It took me an embarrassingly long moment to recognize him. "Oh my lord. David, is that you?" I gasped. The man barely resembled his former self. His hair had grown longer and lank, and he was now sporting a dirty and scraggly beard. His thin frame was now practically emaciated and on clear display given that he wasn't wearing a shirt. His jeans were originally black, but were rendered a sickly shade of brown by a number of stains. Stains that I can only assume were of his own blood. I infer this because his entire naked torso, including his neck and head, was covered in scratches, several of which were actively dripping blood. Some were raised and swollen, inflamed with sepsis and weeping pus. They would have seemed random to anyone else, but I recognized them immediately for what they were. It was a manifesto written in Starspeak, all over his body. Even on the cloth of his jeans, in white chalk, was more smeared Starspeak writing. None of the symbols made sense together. but I recognized quite a few. The most common symbol, repeated again and again, was the glyph best translated to, "Leave me alone. I'm tired of this conversation." It was a harmless symbol. In fact, it was one of my favorites. But seeing it like this, etched into his flesh, it took on a dire new context and a horrifying urgency. The worst thing of all were his eyes, wide and wild, bloodshot and bleary. They reminded me of the one time my father shot a wolf outside our ranch. They were panicked and frightened. When a being used the power and security feels a mortal terror for the first time. They were confused, angry, and dangerous. More than anything, they were full of desperate, maddening desire to cling onto life, by the teeth if need be. He fixed me with his wide-eyed stare, and spoke in a hoarse growl that I had to strain my ears to hear. "You've seen them, haven't you? All this time they were calling, and you were the one who picked up the receiver. You made me listen, and now I can't stop listening. They're screaming at us all the time. Did you know that? We just can't hear them. In space, no one can hear you scream." He started laughing at his own joke, a tired laugh that quickly devolved into tears. "I'm the one who studied and trained. And yet, you're their favorite, their friend. All they do is scream at me. But you..." He grabbed my shoulder in a shockingly strong grip and forced me to turn to face him. "No, they laugh with you, talk with you, scheme with you. Scheme to supplant me. You think you can just get rid of me, like I'm nothing? But I am nothing. We're all nothing next to them. But I'm not the kind of nothing you can just toss out." He gripped me hard, hard enough to hurt, his face now contorted in anger. "But I'm not nobody," he bellowed, stinking spittle flying in my face. "You're not going to replace me. I'm going to replace you." It was only my reflexes that saved me from the knife I didn't see. I watched his free shoulder move, and, even without seeing his hand, knew enough to try and dodge. I turned in his grip, but it was a little too late. I felt the knife glance off the side of my hip, slicing through both the fabric and the flesh there. He pulled back the knife and struck again, and I dodged this time, wrenching out of his grip and falling to the floor. The knife slashed through the air where my body had been and clanged off the metal door frame. Before he recovered his senses, I grabbed his ankles, pulling them towards me as I stood up again. David crashed loudly to the floor, and I took the chance his vulnerability presented. I stomped down on the hand that held the knife, and I heard the bones crack before he yelled in pain. He quickly snatched up the knife and cut the foot that was pinning his hand to the floor. I grunted through the pain and kicked him with the other leg. I heard the air puff out of his lungs, and then I was on top of him, wrestling him for the knife. The knife was slippery with my blood, and his grip was unstable. I wrenched it from his grip, then leapt back, holding the knife in front of me protectively. He rose to his feet, unsteadily, his broken hand dangling uselessly at his side. I tightened my grip on the knife, trying to prepare for whatever he might try next. But at that moment, we both heard a pair of feet pounding up the stairs. "Stop, police!" I heard someone call, and he turned to look down the hall at the approaching noise. He snarled, and then shot towards me. I reflectively jumped back, slashing at him as he charged. But my blade completely missed. Instead of coming for me again, he sprinted right past me before crashing through the window. I heard the splat of his impact on the pavement outside and ran to the shattered frame to look out. I could see the blood and shattered glass on the concrete. But David was nowhere to be found. I let out an exhausted sigh and sank to my knees, the adrenaline finally leaving my system. The police officer rushed over to me, applying some rudimentary first aid. One of my neighbors was a nursing student, and he came over and patched me up. Apparently, All I need is a few more days of antibiotics, and I'll be set. The window is repaired. The blood is cleaned. Tomorrow, I'm going to have to go down to the police station and make my report. I don't know what I'm going to say. I'm afraid now. Afraid to sleep. I'm afraid of what the stars will say when I speak to them next. When I first learned about this, I was so excited to share their secrets and wisdom with the world. Now though, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that I might make another David. I've told you my story, as far as I can see it. You know, as much as I at this point. I'm so lost. What should I do? How should I proceed?